And then the other, the 34%, is a bit surprising on maybe it's an outsourced vendor or somebody else who's designed to go ahead and do that. So interesting to know, and it's going to be something we want to follow up when we have our conversation today. So we're going to start with Impala because this is the #1 difference between your normal outpatient scheduled events and your inpatient admissions. While Impala applies to all areas, it generally doesn't come into play as significantly as it does in the ED. So the very first thing is, you know, what is Impala? And I've given you a resource for Impala fact sheet. I like that, and I like Impala.com. They're usually pretty much up to all the regs, and it has some pretty good FAQs. But as Congress stated, it's to ensure public access of emergency services regardless to the ability to pay. And hospitals are required to provide stabilizing treatments for patients with emergency medical conditions if a hospital is unable to stabilize the patient with that capability or the patient requests, an appropriate transfer should be implemented. Now, one of the kind of sticky points of Impala is the courts have found that the screening and stabilization may not have occurred for days after the ER visit. So a long leg fracture, the court determined in one case that fracture stabilization put the patient in harm, and so therefore the EMC continued for days after. The majority of them are evaluated and treated within the ED. So we're going to stick with kind of the majority rather than the one-off things. The one big thing that all EDs learn very quickly is medical screening may not be delayed to inquire as to the patient financial service or insurance. So registration has to happen in 2 phases. One, a short reg, just enough information to ensure the medical record can be created and orders performed. That's generally the name, the date of birth, the address, and some qualifying things. It's very short. It's usually done in triage, and it gets the ball rolling. The second phase, or the full registration with insurance coverage, eligibility, guarantor, subscriber, co-pays, all of that happens at the bedside at the end of the encounter, at the time the patient is physically discharged and or noted by the physician. You'll see on the whiteboards, they go from to a green color maybe on the room number. It indicates they're ready for discharge. That usually gets the registration staff back out. So this is an area that poses some concerns and some operational issues in your rev cycle. So it's important to do that. So a lot of times I'll see 25 nurses on night shift and 6 docs and a bunch of paramedics and 1 registrar. That isn't going to work. They can't handle the front and the back. So when you're doing your acuity staffing, registration has to be in the mix. You know, if your acuity flexes for nurses and paramedics or other aides, then will also have to flex for the registration staff. So let's take the phases. The phases here, you have a visio of these phases. So you see the patient short reg that I just chatted about. You have your MD orders, your services are rendered, and then it goes down to a satisfied and completed registration, and then it can go over to the edits. Charges are entered into the system, charge reconciliation occurs, it goes through the CDM, HIM, and again ends up the edit. So it requires 2 different tracks to be satisfied before the pre-bill edits can come into play. And that's kind of what's being depicted here. After that, we'll go through the rest of it later where it's the billing phase. But I wanted to point out, you have 2 tracks. You have the Impala requirement first, and then you also have the charges and the documentation and the coding required in order to get that pre-bill edit going. So you've got 2 different things going on there. So as we see the short reg is completed, then you get the clinical provision of care, which could be post-EMTALA or could be EMTALA. I mean, that may be the care. Then you can acquire the demographics, the authorization, and then with EMTALA, there is no requirement for medical necessity review until the patient's stable. So a lot of patients, especially for Medicare, they don't get an ABN in the ED because it's too difficult to figure out when their care stopped and then get them to sign an ABN for the additional care. At what point in that ordering system was the patient stable? So as a general rule, unless they're a long stay, a multi-hour stay, they don't do the medical necessity check. Now you still have to do the AUCs for the radiologies and labs, but that's just a separate thing. Charge capture is a big issue. How do you get the charges in? Are they being reconciled? Who's coding what? So that's going to be a big discussion today. We then go through, after charge capture, the billing system, pre-bills, itemized bills, bill scrubber, the creation of the 837 claim, post-bill reviews, submission of the clean claim to the payer, and then if there's any payer rejection. And ultimately, after all of these steps, you can expect reimbursement. So that would be the payer acceptance of the claim and ensure appropriate payment. You have to look for undercharges and overcharges. So these are the phases. The key processes to make these phases work are complete and accurate documentation. I'm sure everybody on the hundreds of people on the call today are saying, yeah, this guy's not telling me anything new. I need complete and accurate documentation. But what follows that is complete and accurate charge capture. I frequently see things documented that were not charged for. I see things charged for that were not documented. So there are two ways to look at it. There's a manual and an automated pre-bill review of those itemized claims. And then you can look at the clean claim right through the scrubber. How often does this happen? That's on the coding side. And then timely claim submission. Do you have a lot of late charges? Are you missing your timely filing? And then timely reimbursement, that there's no overpayment and underpayment. So somebody in the ED or in internal audit has to start looking for those under overpayments. So we went through the documentation, and so we're now at rendering services. You enter the charges into the system, and that's going to be the focus of some more slides upcoming about how do you get those charges in? Are they a paper charge slip? Are they entered in by a charge entry person in the ED? Are they entered in by HIM? What's that method? And then the charge reconciliation of the right patient, right charge, and right date, which is kind of a nursing function too, making sure they have the right patient, right service, right time, and right date. So then it goes through an automated process in the CDM or to HIM for coding, and then your pre-bill edits. So we're going to stop there and do a polling question, which says, in your facility, the facility, not the physician, evaluation and management visit is derived through automatic points calculator in the system, such as Epic, Cerner, Meditech, derived through chart review by coding or charge entry personnel. Nursing enters the evaluation and management, or there's some other method to get it in there.
We have responses rolling in still, so maybe 20 more seconds or so. Ten seconds. All right, I'm going to end it and share it.
So this is about right. It's about almost a 50-50 split between a charge points calculator that's embedded into the system. Some systems you have control over those points calculator where you can say, yes, do this, do that, the other to make your points. Other systems you do not. And then for coding or charge capture is very common. And then nursing entering in, while it's less, it's still a significant group, and I imagine the others would be people like IT data people. So that's pretty much what we expect to find. And we're going to go through some of the differences between these things. So the first part that we look at, and what the ED is always known, is if you have an ED visit that was registered that has no evaluation and management whatsoever, you have to look at that right away and say, what happened? Sometimes it's a continuation of another visit that previously happened, like a suture removal, where they're registered as being there and there's documentation in the record, but there's not an additional charge. And sometimes it's just a lost charge. We're going to be looking for surgical and medical procedures, supplies, and medication. These are the 4 categories that you can use in charge capture reconciliation. These are the 4 things you can charge for in an ED. And under the supplies would come the prosthetics and orthotics, knee splint, knee immobilizers, walking boots, things like that. Surgical medical procedures will laceration repair and IND, foreign body removal. But the E&M service is common to everything. So we're going to start there. The medical screening exam has to be completed and it has to be documented in the record. And that's one thing when I go into audit, I don't see where the physicians write MSE completed. They don't like to do this for a number of legal reasons. Triage nurse, generally, it's up to the state to determine if it has to be a physician, PA, or NP, but generally regular nurses are not in the MSE quadrant unless they're, unless the state law specifically says they can be, and the board of directors or the board of medical exec committee writes it in your bylaws that they can do the MSE. Nurses are experiencing more documentation-driven charge capture. So that means if they write in laceration repair, generally a laceration repair template will come up and it will talk about the length and the width and the depth and the location to be able to get all that stuff. And so that will go over to the LAC repair documentation. But if they're talking about getting the patient out of bed or assisting them with eating or some nursing function, then points will go in based on what they wrote. So if you have a patient that's combative and you need one-to-one nursing because of the fact they're combative and they're not eligible for restraints and they're confused and their neurostatus shows that, then you would write all that in here in the neurostatus exam, and that documentation would give you points. The MAR, or the medication administration record, is generally what drives the charges for pharmacy items. And because of it being connected to a Pyxis or the drug coming through down to the ED from the pharmacy, most of that is captured. The one thing that you look at when you're doing charge reconciliation is if you gave a drug, say just Zofran, the billing description says per 1 milligram. The vial contains 4 milligrams, but only 2 cc's. So frequently we will see the units of service being 2 instead of 4, or 1 because 1 vial instead of 4. So then the MAR, they're showing you what you gave, but they're not showing the billing description, and that comes through later. So you want to really check in the ED, did those billing units for your drugs happen the way they were supposed to? So when we're looking at the key evaluation and management differentiators between facility and physician, you've got CPT guidance that's applicable to the physicians. You've got CMS 95 or 97 guidelines, again applicable to the physicians. The facility, however, doesn't use those. They use, for the majority of their thing, either CMS or payer guidelines. And CMS gives you very specific 11 points that have to be met. And it's in way back to 2008. So it's been 12 years since this came out. Humana is one of those examples with other payers do this too. They have a different criteria than CMS. So if your point system is solely based on CMS, you might be missing out or overcharging with a Humana. So I sent you a copy of where you can find the Humana Guidelines, and they're quite different than CMS. CMS is pretty specific. It says the following 11 points have to happen. One, they have to follow the intent of the code descriptor in CPT, should be designed to reasonably relate the intensity of resources to the different levels of effort. So not put a charge for a level 1 that's $2,000 and your intensity of service only really shows a minimal effort and there's no way to get to that $2,000. I think more of this stuff is going to start to become really readily apparent when you start to see this price transparency come through and start to show your prices for all your payers, negotiated, what have you. These type of charges are going to start to stand out if they're excessive. Second thing is the coding guideline should be based on facility resources. It specifically says the guideline should not be based on physician resources. So when I go to audit, if I see that every E&M on the physician side is exactly the same as the E&M on the hospital side, that's a great trigger for me to say we have a non-compliant situation going on here as an auditor. So I would drive it up the ladder. So having them identical really doesn't show resource utilization, and that's what this is totally about. Coding guidelines should be clear to facilitate accurate payments and usable for compliance purposes in audits. That means those guidelines should be written. So if you're using a point system in a points calculator in an Epic system, I need the points calculator published in your policy manual to be able to look at the points and derive the same number of points. They have to meet HIPAA requirements. Coding guidelines should only require documentation that's clinically necessary for patient care. So if you have a patient that isn't that sick, but looks fairly wealthy to you, you cannot document everything under the world to get a level 5, while the sweet grandmotherly person who's super nice and wants to bake you cookies when she gets out is a level 5, but you give her a level 1. This is why the coding guidelines have to be done. And this is a common practice in the ED or nursing and medicine, kind of jury rig it to the patient. Coding guidelines should not facilitate gaming or upcoding. Coding guidelines should be written, as we said. The coding guidelines should be applied consistently across the patient, the clinic, or emergency department to which they apply. And so, and they shouldn't change with great frequency, should be readily available to the MAC or a payer. So your coding guidelines can be requested, the written form, at any point in time from anyone reimbursing you. The coding guidelines should result in decisions that could be verified by other hospital staff. So this, you have a payer nurse auditor or a payer medical auditor, and they get your points, and they consistently say that, you know what, you're not doing those points. You're not, there's a randomness, it's not following. What they tend to do is give the same chart to multiple people and see what score they came up with based on your guidelines. So is there some teeth behind these 11 points? Absolutely. And the teeth are greater on the payer side than they are really at CMS. They're really going to have some teeth with your private payers. The one thing that's come out of this is that CMS has seen these go from the bell curve at level 3 to an overarching theme where we're now in 4s and 5s is the predominant thing. So I worked at an institution, about a year and a half ago. They had no 1s, no 2s, 6 3s, 100 4s, and 10,000 5s. Okay, that immediately showed me their point system was not right. E&M must be assigned on these points, and so some caution points have to be applied. These calculators are embedded into systems. So the number one thing is, do you have control over them? Or did these systems embed a third-party calculator for which you don't have control? And that happened a couple years ago with one of the vendors, where they embedded somebody else's stuff that consistently overcharged, and the government went after them. Can your facility adapt to meeting changing needs like COVID? How are you assigning points for that? You know, did you add a point system for the COVID visits? Is your system consistently making 4 or 5, creating the potential for an outside audit? And there is a report called the Pepper Report, and there's a pre-recording on our website of the Pepper Report. But one of those elements in the Pepper is to look at level 4 and 5 charts and compare you against your zip code, against your state, and against the national level. So if you are a hospital of 125 beds and your level 5 exceeds that of a tertiary trauma 1 care center, that's a concern. Internal audit should be routinely performed against the documentation. So where do auditors go to look for problems in an ER? Immediately to the evaluation and management, because that gives the overall theme for the rest of it. So CMS is concerned about the shift. We talk about that. We talked about the Pepper Report. The fact that you will be randomly audited and supine the documentation. An audit immediately after system upgrades. There was one that was quite unfortunate that I worked with several years ago. They had an upgrade in a system, and the system somehow, it just made the points calculator go wonky, and all of a sudden they were all being assigned level 1. So they lost a lot of revenue, and they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these happen. So when you're getting a system upgrade, immediately start to look, because that could affect you either way. So trauma activation is another thing that befuddles the ER revenue cycle. Just about every hospital in the country is a trauma level. Very few in the country are trauma level 3, even fewer for 2, and 1 are very infrequent, maybe 1 or 2, 3 per state. So when you're looking at this, there's one group that certifies this. It has to be designated by the state and local government and verified by the American College of Surgeons. So you just don't come up with a trauma certification. Like a 1, you have to have a neurosurgeon on call and in the building. You have to have neurologist, you have cardiologist, cardiothoracic surgery, anesthesia there, all of that. Different subcategory revenue codes are reported as level 1 through 4. So NUBIC, the National Uniform Billing Committee, decided to set up a revenue code where the last digit is going to be the level you've been assigned. In order to do trauma activation, this is very important, there has to be some sort of documentation that there was pre-hospital notification based on triage information from the caregivers, the American College of Surgeons field criteria, or delivered by inter-hospital transfer, and then activation of the trauma system. The problem is, I have seen when I audited trauma activations in an elevator on the way to surgery. I see a lot of ED patients that come in and they don't thought trauma initially. There was no pre-hospital certification. They walked in, or maybe they're hit by a car. They walked in, and then they activate the trauma. You may not use the code, the HCPCS code for trauma activation, unless it is pre-hospital. That does not mean, and I want to repeat this, this does not mean you don't charge for it. You charge for it in a different fashion, but you have to stick to these guidelines in order to do the trauma activation for CMS. In order to get it, you have to have the pre-hospital care, you have to demonstrate who's at the bedside. They can use GO 390, which is the HCPCS code. Some payers take this, some payers do not. Medicare does. Needs to be at least 31 minutes of facility-based critical care. So that means you have to show 31 face-to-face minutes of resources belonging to the facility, not the physician, taking care of the patient. So I see a lot of times where critical care patients are cut off on their time because the physician ended their critical care time. But there's nursing and respiratory therapists still working on the ventilator and still providing supportive measures of a critical nature that would add to your time. So your time and the physician's time don't necessarily agree. The outside field auditors want them to agree, but you can easily make that case. You use the revenue code of 68X, and X being the level of trauma. So if it's level 1, it's 681. If it's 2, it's 682. And 3, it's 683. Charges must reflect the resource consumed by the facility. Now, I told you that if you didn't have pre-hospital care, somebody walks in, hit by a car, you couldn't charge a GO 390, but you must charge for trauma activation. You would do that with no HCPCS code. You would apply the charge to an uncoded line. So you would do 0681 if it was level 1 and a charge, but no HCPCS code. And then you would also charge your revenue code for your levels. So say you had 20 minutes of critical care. You couldn't use the G code. You can charge the trauma activation with 68X and then an uncoded line, no code on it, and then your normal E&M. Many payers do follow the activation requirements, and most require that the patient be registered as trauma. In field locator, if there's not a 5, a lot of commercial payers will say, nope, not going to do this. So there has to be a 5 there. One consistent non-Medicare requirement, so this may be Humana or UHC, they don't necessarily follow trauma activation for Medicare. They have their own, and they're using the American College of Surgeons and trauma surgeons, and they're saying you have to have 1 documented to be a trauma patient. So that's a confirmed systolic pressure less than 90 in adults and age-specific hypotension in children, so like a 40 in a kid. Respiratory compromise, obstruction, or intubation required, meaning they need respiratory support. Use of blood products to maintain the vital signs in patients that are transferred from other hospitals. So they can be getting sick on the transfer, you have to give them blood, what have you, replenish the blood because they're bleeding. Discretion of the emergency physician. Gunshot wounds in the abdomen, neck, or chest are always considered to be a trauma, no matter if it's with a BB gun or whatever, they're gunshot wounds. Glasgow Coma score or neuro score less than 8 with mechanism attributed to trauma. So they can't have Alzheimer's and get a 5 and qualify. They have to have some sort of attributed method of trauma. So they have Alzheimer's, but they fell in the nursing facility, they hit their head, there's an open wound, that can be a trauma. I want to skip now from the E&Ms and trauma over to where I find most of the charge losses, and that is in the surgical and medical procedures that are provided to the patient. So the problem is there's not consistent documentation-driven charging. So you have to make up templates for incision and drainage and for chest tubes and for INDs and paracentesis and what have you. Nursing tends to fail to document procedures performed by the physician because they've got 4 or 5 patients in a critical nature. They're not in there watching what the doc did and writing it down, but unfortunately, that's based on facility coding. Lacerations, the failure to document links and locations. Now, is it okay to refer to the physician documentation in your nursing notes? Yes, you can. You can say, you know, physician has documented length and location. So you can do that without going through it again. But most of the time, I see a nursing laceration for your top 5 surgical procedures. Templates within the EMR are difficult to use, and they leave room for erroneous or incomplete documentation because you can only choose certain things. There's no designated procedure forms that won't capture the data, requiring coding professionals miss the documentation in the very large volume of notes. So maybe the physician documentation of the lac repair doesn't come in for a day. They've already coded it for the ED and what have you. They may code the physician side because that is going to be a different set of coders. Generally, the physician and the facility coders generally are different people, so they will miss that. So this is the reimbursement. It's often higher than the visit level itself. So an IND is going to reimburse more than most of your visits. So we want to make sure that there's some mechanism in the data acquisition process to say there was a surgical procedure. So some people just have surgical procedure, medical procedure. At the end of all the questions, you say yes to surgical procedure. Up comes some sort of documentation form. The most common surgical procedures, according to the American College of Emergency Physicians, are intubations. Now you charge the intubation, but you cannot charge for the ventilator until they're an inpatient or in observation. So EDs don't charge for vents. Lac repairs, documentation of a location, depth and length, foreign body removal, anterior posterior nasal packing, gastric evacuation, casting and splinting. Casting and splinting is a particular issue because it also falls in the area of prosthetics and orthotics. So what did you do? Did you do an actual splint application using plaster and gauze and what have you, and put a lot of resources in it, or did you get something off the shelf that included the fitting and adjustment? Chest tube insertions, interosseous line insertions are big on kids. Central line insertions, incision and drainage. While the ED staff, including myself, tries to avoid live births like it's the plague and we run very quickly just to get them to OB, these can happen. Foley insertions, lumbar punctures, fractures, manipulations. System documentation, many create templates for the cardiac arrest in the code situation, trauma activation, a live birth, a line insertion, a pleural tap or chest tube, and fracture care. So these are the most common documentation templates. So if you click surgical, in some systems up will come your list of templates. I know it does that in PowerChart. Up comes your list of templates. You click on one of those and off you go. In some EDs, the most common procedures include infusion and injection, a start time, a stop time. And that's why a lot of hospitals are going to automated pumps that record all this and send it over, or there are in some shift change things in the Cerner system, you can create one of these templates that say, I need to document that at shift change. So when did it end? Also, you can't start another bag without it. So kind of things like that. EKGs, 12 lead, 3 lead rhythm strip. It's important you document these, that they were done, because a lot of people will use the 3 lead rhythm strip chart for the monitor, and that's part and parcel of the care of the patient. Respiratory and aerosol, and it's got to be provided by respiratory to be charged. Otherwise, it's part of the nursing standard of care. Pulse ox is part of a monitor. You can't charge that. If there are, however, overnight pulse ox monitoring or 3 sequentials or something like that. Cardioversion is seldom done in the ED unless it's a large, rapid rate. It is never used on ventricular rates. Okay, it's used on atrial rates, so supraventricular tachycardia, AFib, things like that. These are elective cardioversions, where the other one is known as defibrillation. Cardioversion has a code, defibrillation doesn't. CPR, temporary pacing, echoes, and moderate sedation. So these are things in the medical realm, not surgical, that you would be able to charge for. Supplies are one category that charges are a problem. They're either lost or they're late. While performing the category doesn't represent significant revenue because they're usually packaged, it adds to the cost of performing the service. But as a result, it does come into play with cost reports and negotiations for rate setting. The usual culprit is an incorrect CDM or supply labeling process such that the charge entry person can make a mistake. So using barcodes is the quickest way to do that. We find in charge capture, the majority of our issues is an incorrect supply being charged that doesn't match the procedure at all. And these will get caught by line item auditors in the payers that are not Medicare, but they're seldom caught by Medicare. Also, preference card charging could become inaccurate if the supply link is not accurate. So say you have Lawson and you change the Lawson number between the preference card, and now all of a sudden it's instead of charging a central line, is charging a balloon pump or something like that. So you have to be careful, but supplies should be a focus. and make sure that you account for everything that's on your supply card. If there was things there, they usually have an L code on it that the CDM people need to have in the CDM. The reason they're a problem is they're costly, they're voluminous, and frequently come under the domain of somebody else for which you have no control. So you don't even know what's being charged. So charge capture facilities with supplies are really, the issues are found rapidly in inventory control. The stocked equals the charge plus what's remaining on the shelf. So what they said they stocked on Monday is going to equal what's charged. Say there were 5 things charged, 20 stocked on Monday, 5 things charged on Monday, and there are 10 missed on the shelf. That means that 5 of them are unaccounted for and are lost charges. If the supply consistently does not reconcile, root cause should be determined. Look if it's linked. Is there a failure to charge it in the first place, and determine the cause of the aberrancy. Pharmaceuticals are under the control of pharmacies. I told you, Pixeth, but the charge errors in ED are in the math. They use some expensive drugs in the ED. They use TPA, they use bivalirudin, they use some expensive drugs down there. And you go and you look at the charges on the bill, and you look at the final bill with the patient financial service people, and you see that 1 unit comes across, but they really sure charge 10,000 units. So this math is where it happens. It happens after the ED. It happens in the charge capture realm, after provision of care, and the place you spot it is on the bill. So if you see 1s and 2s in those units of service under 636, be highly suspicious. A frequent vendor in the ED is the ondansetron. We talked about that before. Charge capture depends on the method of dispensing. Directly from the pharmacy, it's likely charged at the time they document it as being dispensed. However, if it's coming from the Pixeth, it may not be charged until it's administered. So you may have differences in your time frame, in your timing. So that's important. Other matters. Orders. Orders are a huge charge capture failure due to nursing providing a therapy, but the physician failing to order it because it was verbally requested. I know in the ED, when I first started out as a nurse before I went on to other things, I would do stuff that they said, yeah, do that, and then they forget to order it. So basically, I had practiced medicine without a license, and there was no documentation. So when the charge went in, when I put the charge in, there was nothing to back it up. Most of the errors in charge entry start with the order. This is usually a problem for Epic and Cerner people because a lot of times you can't do it. It doesn't even show in the nursing notes as the capability of doing it until the order exists. So the nurses go ahead and put an order in, but it's not cosigned. Another area we talked about is these orthotics apply where there's just an order apply splint to forearm. What splint? Do you want a gutter one that I'm making, or do you want something out of the box? So what I've trained most of the docs to do where I work is apply forearm orthotic, and that's very clear. Difficulty arises when your charge capture is more manual and the data is not documentation, because nursing and medicine become the key. Frequently coders, physician coders, and charge staff will enter charges. Rarely are charges still in play, but they're there for downtime. Manual charge capture requires a large charge reconciliation at the end of the shift to make sure charges, so it's very labor intensive. So most people are trying to shy away from that. The polling question 3 is your facility who's responsible for the daily charge reconciliation or charge capture. Is that the department that enters the charge, the ED, a specific group of analysts, or patient financial services, the business office, IT, or some other body?
About 20 more seconds. We have a lot of people asking too about the copy of the presentation. So just so everybody does know, we do send out a copy of the presentation as well as the recording after we're done here today. So everybody will receive that along with the CEU for attending live.
Ah,
All right.
there's a prize, CEUs.
There is a prize. All right, looks like it slowed down. I'm going to end it and we'll share the results.
Yeah, the department entering the charge is usually what we're seeing now, especially with documentation-driven charging. I do see in the ED a group of coders. When they have the coders write in the ED, they tend to charge the stuff as well. PFS happens on occasion. They'll go through all the stuff, but they don't go through the documentation as well as other people. So they may go off a charge slip. So I don't see that as often, but these are all common forms, but as you can see, 58% of the group on the phone today are moving towards that documentation or some sort of methodology that usually nursing or charge capture person puts in. So as we move on, there are two categories we have to keep saying. The charge master, which no nurse will ever know really what it is. Charge master is a listed inventory that has the price, the revenue code, the name, and when they put something in, it's automatically coded, so it's hard coded. That means there's a risk. If charge goes in and there's no documentation to support it, the assumption is you don't put the charge in until the documentation's there. So on audit, you'll see a charge and no documentation. So that's usually a CDM issue. The other one, and that's things that, and in the CDM, hard-coded things are things that happen the same way every time. So evaluation and management on your point system, if you get 10 points, it's a level 1. Supplies, yeah, I mean, a supply is a supply is a supply. It doesn't change between patients. Medications are hard-coded because their medication has an NDC, and that's connected to HCPCS code. Medical procedures such as aerosols and EKGs, they come right out of the book, so they can be hard-coded. A soft-coded thing is when the patient charge has to be assessed by a qualified coder. That means somebody who can look at the laceration, the depth, and location and decide if it's a superficial less than 2.5, and that's that code, versus a superficial greater than 2.5 but less than 5, that's another code. The HIM coding is generally the route for surgical. So you can get a clash if you hard code your surgery things in the ED, and HIM's coding it too. The way they get around that is you can hard code things in the ED with price and everything and have the coder review the charge for accuracy. If it's not right, they can correct the charge to another hard coded thing. So I see that frequently. Decision to discharge or bring in the facility is an important opportunity to ensure compliance. Okay, if they're coming on observation, there better be some documentation. You gave them this MOON form, which is Medicare Outpatient Observation Notice. For non-Medicare, there's generally a requirement to provide notification within 24 hours of care management. So the ED is not going to get involved with this, but a lot of times your registration staff will. So if they are going into observation, a lot of times registration will call it in. So you need to kind of know how that is. For patients discharged to home, this is an opportunity to arrange for home health or physician follow-up. So what I usually write on my orders is follow up with past medical doctor or PMD. Well, then they don't have one. Okay, so I've kind of failed in the end. I did all this great care and just completely obliterated the care in the end because we didn't arrange for them to go to clinic or anything else. Doesn't mean they're going to go, but you need to give them the opportunity. For a lot of patients that live on the street, they are street cards for free clinics and what have you. And there's a list that usually goes out to these on the street card of how many patients, obviously not the name or the address, or they don't have one, or anything about them, just the total number that you have referred over to this free clinic. Patients discharged to home, we talked about that. So each decision comes with requisite compliance to ensure compliance and reimbursement. Patient discharge is a key loss leader. So bedside's a standard of practice. So if you let them get out of the bed, they can go to any door like the place is on fire and get out without ever giving co-pays, insurance information, what have you. So the new standard of the industry is to do bedside registration, completion, discharge, and collection of co-pay. So failure to understand patient insurance can lead to failed co-pays. And who does the co-pay collection? The registrars. And are they usually the best trained on it? Probably not, but you need to make sure that the access team puts in that effort to the registration team to make sure they can do the insurance. They can do a Medicaid referral. They can do these things that are going to result in reimbursement, but you have to do that at the bedside. So in phase 2, I've got this itemized bill in the upper right in tan, and then it goes through all these different processes to create a claim, which is an 837 that goes to the payer, and 835 is the thing that comes back says we paid this. If the claim is rejected, that immediately is going to cause rework and extra resources to be consumed. So you have to rework with PFS. They can't do that every day. If it goes through a claim scrubber, while it's still in-house in the blue area, it's going to go to a failed edit. They're going to usually rework it in PFS by sending it back to the department and say, what did you do? So this is the way the claim flows. So the itemized piece is in fact a turning point. It's a pivot point. It goes through internal claims. The 837 institution will be created and sent to the scrubber. It can be internal or it can be a scrubber clearinghouse. It passes the 2 scrubs. It's sent to a payer as a clean claim. And the goal then, you'll hear PFS say, you know, ED, your clean claim rate was 58. Okay, that means 58% of them are worked and the rest failed. So claim is then paid by the payer. The billing failures is the itemized. The first set of internal claims and second set of scrubber edits require attention. This is a root cause. So if you fail to get an order for every single radiology, that's a problem. Post-payment software, post-claim creation, software is used to detect patterns of behavior for loss charges. Meaning this claim is totally done, it's going to the payer, and there's a trigger that says, you know what, this supply can only be used on this procedure, and yet you don't have that procedure. That's a little late in the game, but you can still do it. What you want to do it is at the time of charging. It says, this charge that you just put in is looking for this procedure. So if I put in a suture kit, I better well have some sort of lac repair. If I put in a staple gun, where are my staple procedures? So fighting charge leakage. Their key areas are your late charges. OR is known for that, not the ER. The OR is known for that on Fridays with late cases. Charges that are waiting, you say you deferred it to the physician documentation and they're 2 weeks behind in documenting. Documentation without a charge. Failed processes, incomplete education or auditing. System issues such as mapping in the CDM. Staff. This is a big problem in the ED because you get floats when you get busy and acuity, and they decided you should only have 3 nurses, but you needed 12. You're going to get floats from critical care. They don't know how to put charges in. You're going to get PRN staff that come in. You're going to get per diems. You're going to get agency. All these things can happen in the charge capture. So that's why documentation driven is better as long as they understand the documentation. So how much does this affect? HFMA have put the loss charges nationally at 1 to 5% of the total charges. While that doesn't sound like a lot, over time, that volume represents a huge source of revenue loss. Medicare may not represent separately for most facilities, still have a percent of charge payer mix that can't be ignored. So while you say, I don't need to charge that splint for Medicare, so I'm not going to charge, I'm not going to worry about it. If that person actually has Blue Cross and they pay a percent of charge and I don't put the charge on, then the point they have to pay is 0. So you will always assume everybody is percent of charge unless otherwise specified. Don't forget the splinting and casting. This is the documentation and the coding has to be correct. I have frequently seen CPT codes for orthotics. I've seen orthotics that added a CPT code to it, but the description said fitting and adjustment included. So these two are a problem, but they do pay for those payers that pay a percent of charge. So you don't want to forget them. Depending on the system, there may or may not be a mechanism for these pre-bill edits that I talked about. So Epic has a trademark thing called Revenue Guardian. It's a system where you create your own edits. Epic has nothing to do with it. You create your own edits. So say if you used a suture kit, you could put in all these different laceration types. And then if in fact one of those wasn't there, it would stop the bill, move it to a work queue to be remediated. Then there are also proprietary systems. And the beauty of the proprietary system is somebody else is maintaining all the rules. You would have to maintain all the rules in Revenue Guardian and Epic, and that's a huge resource. But companies have lots and lots of people that maintain these rules, and they're clean and they're up to date. And so therefore, these combinations grow over time. We see association between X and Y. So say I see one of the ones that triggers a lot for us is the supply of an endotracheal tube, but there's no intubation. So what was up with that? So that's a lost charge for a procedure, which is going to pay more usually than the visit. Many systems use a pre-bill scrub of charges to identify it. So this is the safety net: lost charges, overcharges, excessive units. Identify units of service that are below the threshold, or MUE. Identify medication charged with units less than clinically expected. So providers such as ourselves, we have in our system clinically based edits that say, you know what, patient should have this much drug that they ordered, and I've only got a unit of one, but I wanted 20. Duplicate charge identification. This happens a lot when they come in as Jane Doe or John Doe and become Mr. Michael Smith or Jane Smith. So combining those things. So to ensure all charges are present for the documented service, the correct quantity, and therefore move to the billing cycle. It's not the billing edits in the end run. They only scrub for things that are present on the claim. So if you never charge this in the first place, or you charge the wrong thing, those edits aren't going to catch it. So a lot of times I hear, oh, billing will take care of this. They have edits. No, they can't edit for something that was never charged in the first place. So this itemized claim portion is extremely important. So I've got a few minutes left, like 2, to go through charge capture professional, but basically they're responsible for isolating and correcting missing charges. The team works with the facility and an additional proprietary system usually, and then they look at the difference between external and internal generally as the method of review. I want to point out that one of the hospital comparison things that are used a lot is that the hospital compare, and it's just starting to come into the industry standard, but hospitals look at the surgical services that they provided, not anything else, surgical, the CPT 0 through 6999. The surgical procedures in the ED were coded by a hospital coder. The same surgical services will be coded by the physician coder because it should be the same thing. And we find disparity. That's a cause of looking for revenue because somebody was wrong, either the doc coder or the facility coder, but somebody's got it wrong. So these need to be identified. The professional biller will either get an itemized work queue for pre-bill or post-bill that they have to look. The work queues are designed to evaluate the charges and a method suited to the review. So maybe you have an analyst who's a government specialist, another one that's a Blue Cross specialist. They're routing their work queue to their specialty. Service line, high dollar claims. Maybe you start with high dollar, but generally the service line expertise drives the review of charges out of the ED. So not using a cardiology coder and an auditor, and they're not going to know what happens in the ED. It's important to have somebody who knows the ED. So a lot of times when this happens on the revenue cycle team, I see paramedics that work in the ED. They have a couple of them and they review all the itemized charges and say, yeah, that would have happened here. No, well, I don't know what that is, you know? So that was worked through a case routing mechanism to get them to the right people. So we talked about that. The key to case routing is that it's dynamic and can be changed on situation. So we get a lot of requests, you know, so-and-so is going on maternity leave and so-and-so needs to handle all their caseload while they're gone. So we have to change the caseload over to the new person and then determine what it's going to be when the person comes back. Making sure that if you have a level 5, you have supplies and pharmaceuticals. It's hard to get to a 5, and do nothing else. So medical procedures, under medical procedures comes radiology and lab. So, you know, they're charged by radiology, they're charged by lab. But if you don't have any of that and you have a level 4 or 5, that's a problem. What's going on there? If you have a lot of labs in radiology in the converse and you have a level 1, that's another issue. And that's how we spotted that after the upgrade happened. First of all, we saw they were all 1s, but then we saw a lot of things that definitely it would be a 5 or had critical care time. The method is to look at the potential lost charge, either as missing or charges that don't make sense together. So say you see an electrophysiology catheter on a CVP line insertion, so that's a midline insertion. They're incompatible items, so what's not right? Duplicate charges happen all the time because one person charging and the other person charging, and that has a root cause problem. A day in the life, you're going to look at, as I said, level 5 without anything. We're going to look at Zofran for units of 10,000, or a charge is ridiculous. You know, I worked at a major IDN a couple years ago, and their decimal points got screwed up over the weekend. And suddenly ED levels were starting at $1 million. And they had payers that were paying $1 to $5 million that had to go and get redressed. But that was a simple patch job on a computer system on a weekend, came in Monday, and we see that the gross revenue skyrocketed over the weekend in the ED to like 50, 60 million dollars. Okay, what happened? Laceration without the repair, trauma level 5 without the 6.8 revenue code, and all through this toxoid without a toxin. So thousands of combinations. The chart review is identified in the software, then the professional will have to go into the chart and look and say it's either accurate, no action required, inaccurate, correct it, or duplicate, issue a credit. Very similar to pre-bill is the chart review. There are 2 places to obtain it before the data. That's right after the internal system, such as Cerner or Epic, creates an 837 before it goes to the final scrubber. You would want to get this, and this is another way to capture those charges before it hits the claim. And then your team is usually resides in revenue integrity and PFS, but those teams have to understand the ER process flow, technology, everything. So they need to be oriented to the ED for weeks at a time to make sure they understand what nursing's doing and what have you, so they can take that back and they can work with these lost charges. Fully perform the role, the professional should have coding experience, but they're not necessarily certified. You can do that because they have access to a coding professional. And to sum it up, it's the source of volume and financial reimbursement for the facility, a big one. It is a known area of charge leakage. So that you're doing a heavy duty work in a very fast and very voluminous thing, and maybe you don't have a charge in, so that you can't document. When you document it, nothing happens. Charge capture losses can be overcharges too. Software can identify aberrancies between as the best defense against charge leakage. So looking for X to Y or X to Y to Z. And the key here is to audit, either through software or a person. And discharge can represent that opportunity to get your co-pays, which are very, very, very important to get, because once they get out the door, when they say, send me a bill, that's difficult. So I always say, you're going to have a $100 copay before you leave tonight. How would you like to pay that, with a check or credit card? We don't really give them the answer. We just only offer those 2 things. And then they say, I would like you to send a bill, and say, unfortunately, because you have the copay, our policy is that we collect it at time of service. So there you go with that. And now, Dusty, I think we're over, but do we have questions that need to happen?
We actually scheduled this one for a little longer, so we do have some time to answer questions today. And we did have a bunch of good ones come in, and so we'll do a few here for sure. Again, if you do have questions, please submit those to the Q&A panel. And thanks to everybody for engaging in those polls throughout. That was really fun to see.
If you don't mind going over, I can do some questions. The first one is, if a patient leaves AMA prior to seeing the physician and the nurse performs a triage, can the hospital bill a low level? No, they may not. CMS has answered this multiple times. In order to, and for individual payers, they have to be able to have had a face-to-face with a designated medical professional, be that a nurse practitioner, PA, or MD. So you may not charge it. It is basically a missed appointment. You may charge the patient privately on self-pay, but you're good luck collecting that. So most people have moved that to a statistic to see for their quality standards how many people are leaving after they have been registered. Stephanie writes, would it be accurate to expect E&M for the facility to be coded higher than professional fees in general? There is no in general with that. And many times a physician will put a lot of work into something, and in fact, that doesn't require a lot of work from nursing. So you have somebody who has got some sort of problem with their mentation. They come from a nursing home. It doesn't require a lot of work for the nurse, but it requires a lot of work for the physician. So I wouldn't say in general, they shouldn't correlate ever. Is there a list of commonly missed procedures or supplies getting captured in the ED? This is really quite dependent on your facility. I've seen people losing supplies with surgical procedures, with medical, and then I've seen overcharging. So that's specific to yours. The list that I gave out in a slide earlier is probably just a starting point. So Leanne writes, so trauma activation can be charged for walk-ins or by a card. Yes, you can use it in an uncoded revenue code with a charge. Most people have a tiered trauma activation. So if it's a trauma activation from the field, there's one price, and then there's trauma activation inside the facility. There's usually two tiers of it, minor and moderate, or moderate and severe. So you can, but you has to be an uncoded. Most commercial payers will not pay that. And Medicare, it's just going to be bundled with the procedure, but it will come out on your cost report. Karen, does a nurse have to participate in the medical procedure to charge if hold on, Dusty, I'm getting nauseated here, jumping around. Does a nurse have to participate in the medical procedure in order to charge a procedure? Generally, they have to be in there, and most nurses will clean the wound. They will put dressings on and what have you, so they're in there. They don't have to be part of the suture repair because obviously that's outside the scope of their license. I mentioned a gastric evacuation. I thought the facility side was included in the E&M. It also regards to casting splint. You mentioned size, patient splint can be chargeable. If I heard that correctly, even if a prefabricated state, yes, prefabricated is known as an orthotic, okay? It's on the prosthetic and orthotic fee schedule, and you are able to charge that separately. It's not a supply, it's actually an orthotic. So yes, you can. Medicare may not pay for it separately. It's included in the price, but they can do that. Dusty, I'm not done with that one. Can you move back? Or no?
Yeah, just go to answered. Sorry, the answered tab.
Okay. Then charging by intent, for example, the gas. Let's talk about the tube evacuation. You absolutely can charge for the tube. Because it is specific to the patient, it's usually disposable, and there's nursing that usually puts the tube in. So yes, the physician's usually in attendance for that. NG tubes are included in the E&M if not done by a physician, because there is gastric intubation by physician is a CPT code they would charge. Does CMS recognize, for example, the doc mentioned that the Foley was placed for residual? No, it does not. You need an order. For all things, there has to be an order on behalf of a licensed professional. So a Foley for a facility side, you can charge a Foley, but you can't charge a procedure, and the doc can't either unless there's an order. Could you elaborate on the trauma? I had a GSW, but the provider document is punctate and abrasion. Would this need to be queried? Oh, absolutely. If you know that EMS brought them in after a gunshot wound, that gunshot wound needs to be identified. It can be documented as punctuate and abrasions. If that's basically one that the GSW actually grazed the skin. So yeah, you definitely have to document that the causative agent was a gunshot. Is that it?
That's all we got right now. So I just want to thank everybody again for attending. We did have a lot of questions. There is CEU attached to this, so you will receive a link to where you can watch the recording of this. You can download the slides, and it will also have information about how to get your CEU for this in the follow-up email. So expect
And
that.
Dusty, how do they
Yes.
get, if they have further questions after that, after they have a think on that, how do they get hold of us? Use my email that's in the slide, or how's the best way for them to ask a question?
Yep, so Bill's email is in the slide deck, so you can do that. I mean, you can reach us any way you'd want, whatever easiest for you. If you go to vitaware.com, the easiest is probably just through live chat on any page on our website, or you can submit a form and ask what question you have. We'll make sure that gets to Bill or the right person and get back to you with the right answer.
It's been a pleasure speaking this afternoon. I hope you got value out of it. It's been fun presenting it. And I look forward to interacting with you on future talks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.